David Berkowitz sat in a patrol car outside his Yonkers apartment building on August 10, 1977, handcuffed and smiling. The 24-year-old postal worker had just been arrested as the infamous Son of Sam, the .44 caliber killer who had terrorized New York City for 13 months, killing 6 people and wounding 7 others in seemingly random attacks that had paralyzed the nation's largest city with fear. As detectives read him his Miranda rights, David looked almost relieved, his smile widening as he said, "You got me. How come it took you such a long time?" Over the next several hours, David would confess to all 8 shooting attacks, claiming he had been ordered to kill by a demon that spoke to him through his neighbor's black Labrador retriever. The demon's name was Sam, and David was his obedient son, the Son of Sam. But this bizarre story of demonic possession was just the first of many lies David would tell about his crimes. Years later, he would admit the demon story was a complete fabrication designed to make him appear insane. Then he would claim he was part of a satanic cult that orchestrated the murders as ritual sacrifices. Then he would become a born-again Christian and claim redemption and remorse he had never shown at his trial. Through it all, one thing remained constant. David Berkowitz was a U.S. Army-trained marksman who had used those skills to hunt and kill young people in the prime of their lives. And he would spend the rest of his life in prison for those crimes, denied parole again and again and again, living out his days in a cell, reflecting on the summer of terror he created and the lives he destroyed. If you're watching this video, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. David Richard Berkowitz was born Richard David Falco on June 1, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York, to Betty Broder Falco, a married woman having an affair. Betty was 37 years old when she gave birth to David in a home for unwed mothers, having kept the pregnancy secret from her husband, Tony Falco, who was not the father. The biological father was Joseph Kleinman, a married real estate businessman with whom Betty had been having an extramarital relationship for several years. Neither Betty nor Joseph had any intention of raising the child together. Betty already had an adult daughter from her marriage and couldn't explain a new baby to her husband. And Joseph had no interest in leaving his own family or acknowledging an illegitimate child. Within days of his birth, the infant who would become David Berkowitz was adopted by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a childless Jewish couple from the Bronx who had been trying to have children for years without success. Nathan, 42 years old at the time, worked in the hardware business and ran a small shop in the Bronx. Pearl, 38, was a homemaker who had suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths over the years and had given up hope of ever having a biological child. When their rabbi connected them with a private adoption opportunity, they jumped at the chance. They paid Betty Falco several $1,000s, a substantial sum in 1953, and took the baby home to their small but comfortable apartment on Stratford Avenue in the Bronx. They named him David Richard Berkowitz and vowed to give him all the love and opportunities they had dreamed of giving their own biological child. By all accounts, David's early childhood was relatively normal, even privileged compared to many children in their working-class neighborhood. Nathan and Pearl doted on their adopted son, spoiling him with toys, clothes, and attention. Pearl, in particular, was obsessively devoted to David, rarely letting him out of her sight. She walked him to school every day, even when he was old enough to go alone. She prepared elaborate meals for him. She defended him against any criticism from teachers, neighbors, or even Nathan. In Pearl's eyes, David could do no wrong, and she made sure everyone knew it. But Nathan saw things Pearl refused to acknowledge. From an early age, David displayed concerning behaviors. He was aggressive toward other children, hitting and pushing them during playground disputes. He was cruel to animals. Neighbors recalled seeing David throw rocks at birds, kick dogs, and once trap a cat in a cardboard box and shake it violently while laughing at the animal's distress. He threw violent temper tantrums when he didn't get his way, screaming and breaking things until Pearl gave in to his demands. He was clumsy and uncoordinated, constantly injuring himself in ways that suggested either extreme carelessness or an unconscious desire for attention and sympathy. Teachers at PS 74 in the Bronx noted all of these issues in reports sent home to Nathan and Pearl throughout David's elementary school years. Mrs. Gloria Martinez, David's third-grade teacher, wrote in his 1962 report card, "David is an intelligent boy who could do well if he applied himself, but he is disruptive in class and has difficulty getting along with his peers. He seems to crave attention constantly and will act out negatively when he doesn't receive it. I recommend psychological evaluation." Pearl dismissed the recommendation, insisting that teachers just didn't understand David's spirited personality. The issue of David's adoption was another source of profound psychological damage. Nathan and Pearl had decided to tell David about his adoption from an early age, believing that honesty was the best policy, and that David deserved to know the truth about his origins. They told him when he was 7 years old, sitting him down at the kitchen table and explaining in simple terms that he had been chosen specially by them, that they had wanted him so much, that he was loved. David's response was to ask why his real mother hadn't wanted him. Pearl tried to explain that sometimes adults make difficult decisions, that his birth mother had loved him but couldn't care for him. But David heard only rejection. From that day forward, he became obsessed with the idea that he had been unwanted, discarded, fundamentally unlovable. David began acting out more severely after learning of his adoption. He shoplifted from local stores, not because he needed anything, but because the thrill of stealing and the attention he received when caught gave him a rush. He set small fires in trash cans and abandoned lots, watching with fascination as the flames consumed whatever he had ignited. He engaged in increasingly dangerous pranks, throwing objects off rooftops, vandalizing cars, sneaking out at night to wander the dark streets of the Bronx alone. Pearl made excuses for every incident. Nathan grew increasingly frustrated, but he was passive by nature and deferred to his wife on matters concerning David. In 1967, when David was 14 years old, disaster struck the Berkowitz family. Pearl, David's adoptive mother, and the only person who had consistently protected and defended him despite his behavior, was diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis came late. Pearl had ignored symptoms for months, not wanting to face the possibility of serious illness. And by the time she finally saw a doctor, the cancer had metastasized to her lymph nodes and beyond. She underwent a mastectomy and aggressive chemotherapy, treatments that were far more brutal in the 1960s than they are today. Pearl suffered terribly, losing her hair, becoming skeletal thin, enduring constant pain and nausea. David watched his mother's decline with a mixture of horror and resentment. He resented that she was no longer focused entirely on him, that she was too sick to cook his favorite meals or defend him when Nathan criticized his behavior. He resented that other family members and friends came to the apartment to care for Pearl, taking attention that he felt belonged to him. But underneath the resentment was genuine terror. Pearl was the one constant in his life, the one person who had never criticized or rejected him, and now she was dying. Pearl Berkowitz died on October 3, 1967, with David at her bedside. Her last words to him, according to David's later recollections, were, "Be a good boy." David was 14 years old, and the foundation of his world had just been destroyed. He would later tell psychiatrists that Pearl's death was the pivotal moment in his life, the moment when whatever small chance he had of becoming a normal, functional adult was lost forever. In the months following Pearl's death, David spiraled. His grades, which had been marginal at best, plummeted. He stopped attending school regularly, forging absence notes in Nathan's handwriting. He spent his time alone in his room, listening to rock music at deafening volumes, reading true crime magazines and books about serial killers and mass murderers, and masturbating compulsively to violent pornographic images. He gained weight and became slovenly in his appearance, rarely bathing or changing his clothes. Nathan, consumed by his own grief and struggling to keep his business afloat, was largely absent from David's life during this period. By 1968, David had effectively dropped out of high school, attending sporadically, if at all. Nathan enrolled him in a community college program for troubled youth, but David lasted less than a semester before being asked to leave due to excessive absences and disruptive behavior. Nathan tried to involve David in the hardware business, bringing him to work and teaching him the trade, but David showed no interest and was fired after just 2 weeks for showing up late, being rude to customers, and stealing petty cash from the register. In 1969, Nathan Berkowitz began dating again. He met a widow named Helen Weiss, who had her own grown children from her previous marriage. Nathan and Helen fell in love, and in 1970, they announced their intention to marry and relocate to Florida, where Helen had family and where Nathan believed he could find better business opportunities. The plan was for David to come with them, to start fresh in a new environment, away from the bad memories and influences of the Bronx. But David felt, once again, rejected and unwanted. He saw Helen as an intruder, trying to replace his mother. He resented Nathan for moving on with his life, while David was still drowning in grief. When Nathan and Helen married in early 1971 and moved to Florida, David declined to join them. He was 18 years old, legally an adult, and he made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. He enlisted in the United States Army. David Berkowitz joined the U.S. Army on June 18, 1971, just days after his 18th birthday. He reported to Fort Knox, Kentucky for basic training, arriving with a duffel bag containing everything he owned, and a head full of rage and resentment toward the world. His drill instructors immediately pegged him as a problem soldier. He was out of shape, struggled with the physical demands of basic training, had difficulty following orders, and was frequently caught talking back or complaining. He received multiple Article 15 non-judicial punishments for minor infractions, like failing to maintain his uniform standards, being late for formation, and arguing with superiors. But there was one area where David Berkowitz excelled: marksmanship. On the firing range with an M16 rifle, David discovered something extraordinary about himself. When he held a weapon and aimed at a target, all the chaos and noise in his mind quieted. He felt focused, powerful, in control. His hand was steady, his breathing regulated, his aim was nearly perfect. He qualified as a sharpshooter on his first attempt, scoring in the top 10% of his training company. His drill instructors noticed and encouraged him to pursue advanced marksmanship training, seeing potential in this otherwise mediocre recruit. After completing basic training at Fort Knox, David was sent to Fort Sam Houston in Texas for additional training, and then, in early 1972, he received orders for his first overseas deployment, South Korea. He was assigned to the 8th Army, stationed near the demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea, a tense posting where American forces maintained constant vigilance against potential North Korean aggression. David's time in Korea was marked by isolation and alienation. He had no close friends among his fellow soldiers, who found him strange, sullen, and unpleasant to be around. He spent his off-duty hours alone in his barracks, reading, writing in his diary, and visiting prostitutes in the nearby town of Dongducheon. The encounters with prostitutes were frequent. David would later estimate he visited brothels dozens of times during his deployment. But they brought him no satisfaction or connection. Instead, they left him feeling even more empty, ashamed, and angry. He began to develop a deep-seated hatred of women, viewing them as manipulative, deceitful, and deserving of punishment. In his diary, which military police would later seize and analyze after his arrest, David wrote increasingly disturbing entries during his time in Korea. In one entry from March 1973, he wrote, "Women are the source of all evil in this world. They tempt men and then destroy them. They deserve to suffer." In another entry from June 1973, "I dream about hurting people. I dream about making them feel the pain I feel every day. One day I will stop dreaming and start doing." In yet another entry, "No one understands me. No one ever has. I am completely alone in this world, and that's how it will always be. The only way I will ever be remembered is if I do something that forces people to remember me. David was honorably discharged from the U.S. Army on May 12, 1974, having served just under 3 years and achieving the rank of Private First Class. He received the National Defense Service Medal and the Army Good Conduct Medal, standard decorations for service members who complete their enlistment without major disciplinary issues. He also received specialized training as a marksman that had made him expert in handling firearms and placing shots with deadly accuracy. David returned to New York in late May 1974 with no plan, no prospects, and no support system. Nathan was still in Florida with Helen, and while they maintained occasional contact by phone, the relationship between David and his father was distant and strained. David moved into a cheap apartment in the Bronx and began applying for jobs. He was hired by the U.S. Postal Service as a part-time mail sorter at a facility in the Bronx, a job that required minimal qualifications and offered minimal pay. He worked overnight shifts, sorting envelopes and packages in a massive warehouse alongside dozens of other workers. The job was mind-numbing and isolating. Workers were discouraged from talking to each other so they could maintain productivity quotas, and David found it suited him perfectly. He didn't want to interact with people. He just wanted to earn enough money to survive. During his off hours, David began the behaviors that would eventually lead him to murder. He prowled the streets of New York at night, walking for hours through different neighborhoods, watching people, studying their routines, identifying vulnerabilities. He set fires, hundreds and hundreds of fires over the next 2 years. Trash cans, dumpsters, abandoned cars, vacant buildings. He kept meticulous records in his diary of every fire he set, noting the date, time, location, and his assessment of the damage. He would later claim he set approximately 1,500 fires between 1974 and 1977, though this number has never been verified. What is certain is that dozens of arsons during this period remain unsolved and match David's patterns. In December 1975, David decided fires weren't enough. The urge to kill had been growing inside him for years, and he could no longer resist it. On Christmas Eve 1975, David armed himself with a hunting knife and drove to Co-op City in the Bronx. He parked his car and began walking through the massive housing complex, looking for a victim. At approximately 1 a.m., he encountered 15-year-old Michelle Foreman, who was walking home from a friend's Christmas Eve celebration. David approached her from behind and, without warning, began stabbing her repeatedly in the back and head with the hunting knife. Michelle screamed and fought back, throwing her arms up to protect herself and managing to grab the blade of the knife, cutting her hands badly, but preventing David from continuing his attack. Her screams attracted attention. Lights came on in nearby apartment windows. Someone yelled that they were calling the police, and David fled into the night. Michelle collapsed on the sidewalk, bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds. She was rushed to Jacobi Hospital, where she underwent emergency surgery and survived, though she was left with permanent physical and psychological scars from the attack. Police investigated the stabbing but had few leads. Michelle could provide only a vague description of her attacker, a white male in his 20s, medium build, wearing dark clothing. There was no DNA evidence recovered, no witnesses who could provide additional details, and no apparent motive. The case remained unsolved. David, meanwhile, felt simultaneously exhilarated by the attack and frustrated that he hadn't succeeded in killing Michelle. He decided that next time, he would use a gun. Knives required too much physical contact, too much struggle. A gun would be quick, efficient, and final. In February 1976, David Berkowitz purchased a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver from a gun shop in Houston, Texas, during a trip to visit his father in Florida. Texas gun laws at the time were far more permissive than those in New York, and David was able to buy the weapon with minimal paperwork, just a driver's license and a signed form attesting that he wasn't a convicted felon or mentally ill person prohibited from owning firearms. The Bulldog was a powerful weapon, designed for stopping power at close range. Its large-caliber rounds could cause massive trauma and were nearly always fatal when striking vital organs or the head. It was the perfect weapon for an aspiring serial killer. David returned to New York with the gun and spent the next several months preparing for his first shooting attack. He practiced at a makeshift shooting range he set up in a remote area of the Bronx, firing at paper targets until he was confident he could place shots accurately under pressure. He drove through various neighborhoods in his cream-colored Ford Galaxie, identifying areas where young people congregated: parks, bars, restaurants, late-night diners. He was looking for targets, and he was looking specifically for young women with long, dark hair. Though he would later claim his victim selection was random, there was in fact a clear pattern. David was hunting women who reminded him of the prostitutes he had visited in Korea. Women whose sexuality both attracted and repelled him. Women he believed deserved to be punished. On July 29, 1976, at approximately 1:10 a.m., David Berkowitz committed his first murder. Donna Loria, 18 years old, and her friend, Jody Valenti, 19, were sitting in Jody's car outside Donna's apartment building on Burr Avenue in the Pelham Bay neighborhood of the Bronx. The two young women had just returned from a night out at a disco in New Rochelle and were sitting in the car talking. Not yet ready to end the evening. Donna lived with her parents in the apartment building directly in front of where they were parked. Jody lived nearby. David drove past the car once, noting the two young women inside. Both had long, dark hair. Both fit his preferred victim profile. He circled the block and parked his car several spaces behind Jody's vehicle. He retrieved the .44 Bulldog from under his seat, checked to ensure it was loaded, and stepped out of his car. He walked quickly toward Jody's car, his right hand concealed in his jacket pocket, holding the revolver. As he approached, he pulled the gun out, extended his arm, and without saying a word, fired 5 shots through the passenger window directly at the two women. Donna Loria was hit in the neck by the first shot. The bullet severed her spinal cord, and she died almost instantly, slumping forward in her seat. Jody Valenti was hit in the thigh by another bullet, the impact and sudden pain causing her to scream. David stood there for a moment, looking at his victims, then turned and walked calmly back to his car. He drove away at a normal speed, not speeding or drawing attention to himself. Behind him, Jody was screaming for help, honking the car horn, trying to wake up the neighborhood. Donna's parents, Mike and Rose Loria, heard the screams and the honking from their apartment and looked out the window to see their daughter's head slumped forward in the car below. The shooting made headlines in local newspapers, but didn't receive extensive citywide attention initially. At the time, New York City was experiencing high crime rates, and random shootings, while tragic, were not uncommon. Police investigated the Loria murder as a possible mob hit. Donna's father, Mike, was questioned extensively about possible gambling debts or business conflicts that might have made him a target, but nothing was found to support that theory. Ballistics analysis of the bullets recovered from the scene and from Donna's body showed they were .44 caliber, an unusual choice for street criminals at the time, who typically preferred smaller, more concealable handguns. But with no witnesses providing useful descriptions and no apparent motive, the case quickly went cold. David Berkowitz, meanwhile, was euphoric. He had finally crossed the line from fantasy to reality, from dreaming about murder to actually committing it. He felt powerful, significant, important. For the first time in his miserable life, he had done something that mattered, that had impact. One person was dead because of him. Another was wounded. Families were devastated. Police were investigating. He had made the world notice him, and the feeling was intoxicating. Over the next 11 months, David would strike 7 more times, killing 5 more people and wounding 6 others, transforming from an unknown postal worker into the most hunted criminal in New York City history. The second attack came just over 2 months later, on October 23, 1976. Carl Denaro, 20 years old, and Rosemary Keenan, 18, were sitting in Carl's car outside Rosemary's home in Flushing, Queens, at approximately 1:30 a.m. They had spent the evening at a bar in Forest Hills and were saying goodnight. Both had attended the same high school and had known each other for years. Carl was home on leave from the U.S. Air Force, where he was serving as an aviation machinist. David had driven to Queens that night, specifically to hunt. He spotted Carl's car with its 2 occupants and circled back. He parked several car lengths behind, approached on foot with the .44 Bulldog concealed, and fired 5 shots through the rear window. Carl was struck in the head by one of the bullets, the impact so violent that he thought at first that someone had smashed the window with a baseball bat. Blood poured from the wound, obscuring his vision, and he slumped forward, barely conscious. Rosemary, miraculously unhit despite several bullets passing inches from her head, screamed and threw open her car door, running toward her house to call for help. Carl Denaro survived, but the bullet had fractured his skull and penetrated his brain, requiring emergency surgery and weeks of hospitalization. He would suffer from headaches, memory problems, and partial paralysis for the rest of his life. Police again investigated the shooting, but found no connection to the Loria murder. The jurisdictions were different, Bronx versus Queens. The circumstances seemed different. Loria was killed while Denaro survived, and investigators didn't yet recognize they were dealing with a serial killer. David struck again just 3 weeks later. On November 27, 1976, at approximately 12:30 a.m., Joanne Lomino, 18, and Donna DeMasi, 16, were walking home from a late movie in the Belrose neighborhood of Queens. As they approached Joanne's house on 262nd Street, they noticed a man standing near the stairs. He approached them and asked for directions. Joanne and Donna, raised to be polite, stopped and tried to help him. The man, David Berkowitz, pulled out the .44 Bulldog and opened fire at point-blank range. Joanne was shot in the back, the bullet severing her spinal cord and paralyzing her from the waist down. Donna was shot in the neck but survived. Both girls collapsed on the front steps of Joanne's house, screaming. David fled immediately, running to his car and driving away. Joanne's parents heard the shots and the screams and found their daughter lying on their front steps, unable to move her legs, crying and asking what was happening to her. The attack on Lomino and DeMasi finally began to ring alarm bells among law enforcement. The use of a .44 caliber handgun, the targeting of young women in Queens, the time of night. These details were starting to form a pattern. NYPD detectives pulled ballistics reports on recent shootings involving .44 caliber weapons and discovered that the bullets recovered from the Denaro shooting matched those from the Lomino-DeMasi shooting. They were fired from the same gun. New York had a serial shooter on its hands, but before police could mobilize a coordinated response, David struck again. On January 30, 1977, at approximately 12:40 a.m., Christine Freund, 26, and her fiancé, John Deal, 30, were sitting in John's car in the Ridgewood neighborhood of Queens after spending the evening at a movie and dinner. They were engaged to be married in June and were discussing wedding plans. David drove past their car, circled back, parked, and approached on foot. He fired 3 shots through the passenger window. Christine was struck twice, once in the head and once in the shoulder. John was not hit. Christine slumped forward, unconscious, blood pouring from her wounds. John threw the car into gear and drove frantically toward the nearest hospital, honking his horn continuously to alert traffic. Christine Freund died at the hospital several hours later without regaining consciousness. The murder of Christine Freund created a media firestorm. This was the second young woman killed in Queens in 6 months, and now the press was reporting that police believed a serial killer was targeting young people in parked cars. Newspapers began running front-page stories warning people to be careful late at night, to avoid sitting in parked cars, to be aware of their surroundings. The NYPD announced the formation of a special task force to investigate the shootings, eventually called Operation Omega, consisting of over 200 detectives from various departments and jurisdictions working together to find the killer. David Berkowitz was following the news coverage with intense satisfaction. He bought every newspaper that mentioned the shootings, cutting out articles and saving them in a scrapbook. He watched television news reports, thrilling at the sight of reporters standing at crime scenes, describing the terror gripping the city. He was no longer invisible. He was the most important person in New York. Millions of people were talking about him, thinking about him, fearing him. It was everything he had ever wanted. On March 8, 1977, David escalated his attacks in a way that would change everything. Virginia Voskerichian, 19 years old, was a student at Barnard College who lived with her family in Forest Hills, Queens. On that evening, she was walking home from Columbia University where she had been studying late at the library. At approximately 7:30 p.m., earlier than any of David's previous attacks, Virginia was walking along Dartmouth Street, less than a block from her home, when David approached her on foot. He had parked his car nearby and was prowling the neighborhood on foot, looking for a victim. When he saw Virginia walking alone, he followed her for several feet, then raised the .44 Bulldog and fired a single shot at her face from less than 3 feet away. Virginia raised her textbook instinctively to protect herself, but the bullet tore through the book and struck her in the head, killing her instantly. She collapsed on the sidewalk. David stood over her body for several seconds. Witnesses later reported seeing a man standing near the body, then walked away calmly. Virginia's body was discovered by a man walking his dog minutes later. When police arrived, they found her lying on the cold sidewalk, her blood pooling around her head, her textbook still clutched in her hands, the bullet hole visible through the pages. The murder of Virginia Voskerichian in broad daylight, well, in the early evening, but while people were still out and about, sent New York City into a genuine panic. This killer wasn't just striking at night in isolated areas. He was willing to shoot someone on a residential street in early evening, when witnesses might be present. The sense that no one was safe at any time of day or night became pervasive. Gun stores reported a massive surge in sales. Private security companies saw their business increase exponentially. Women with long, dark hair began cutting their hair short or dyeing it blonde, believing, incorrectly as it would turn out, that the killer specifically targeted brunettes. Mayor Abraham Beame held a press conference, announcing that the city was devoting unprecedented resources to catching the killer. Police Commissioner Michael Codd announced that the task force was expanding to 300 detectives, and that they were following hundreds of leads. But the truth was, police had very little to go on. Ballistics showed all the shootings were connected. Same gun, same killer. But they had no useful witness descriptions, no fingerprints, no DNA evidence. Forensic DNA testing didn't yet exist. At no apparent motive or connection between the victims. Then, on April 17, 1977, David made his first major mistake. Alexander Esau, 20, and Valentina Suriani, 18, were sitting in Valentina's car near the Hutchinson River Parkway in the Bronx at approximately 3 a.m. They had been dating for several months and had spent the evening together. David approached their car and fired 4 shots through the passenger window. Both Alexander and Valentina were struck multiple times. Both died at the scene, holding hands. Their lives ended before they had barely begun. But this time David left something behind. A letter. Placed on the street near the car was a handwritten note in a plain white envelope addressed to NYPD Captain Joseph Borelli, who was leading the Son of Sam task force. The letter was rambling, misspelled, and disturbing. It was also the first time the killer gave himself a name. The letter read, in part, "I am deeply hurt by your calling me a women hater. I am not. But I am a monster. I am the son of Sam. I am a little brat. When Father Sam gets drunk, he gets mean. He beats his family. Sometimes he ties me up to the back of the house. Other times he locks me in the garage. Sam loves to drink blood. Go out and kill, commands Father Sam. Behind our house, some rest. Mostly young, raped and slaughtered. Their blood drained. Just bones now. Papa Sam keeps me locked in the attic, too. I can't get out, but I look out the attic window and watch the world go by. I feel like an outsider. I'm on a different wavelength than everybody else, programmed to kill. However, to stop me, you must kill me. Attention all police. Shoot me first. Shoot to kill, or else keep out of my way or you will die. Papa Sam is old now. He needs some blood to preserve his youth. He has had too many heart attacks. Ugh, me hoot, it hurts, sonny boy. I miss my pretty princess most of all. She's resting in Our Lady's house, but I'll see her soon. I am the monster, Beelzebub, the chubby behemoth. I love to hunt, prowling the streets looking for fair game, tasty meat. The women of Queens are prettiest of all. It must be the water they drink. I live for the hunt.